Welcome everyone to today's Cultivating Success webinar. This is part 3 of a 5-part series on integrated pest management. Today, we're going to be talking about cultural and physical pest control. The Cultivating Success program was established in 2000 by University of Idaho Extension, Washington State University Extension, and the nonprofit organization Rural Roots. If you're new to Cultivating Success, please visit our website at cultivatingsuccess.org to see the other programs that we offer. Just a couple of webinar tips. Sometimes people are unfamiliar with the webinar format. In this format, you're going to be able to type your comments into the chat box, and you can type questions for the speakers in either the Q&A box or the chat box. We are recording this webinar, and the webinar and the slide handout are going to be posted on the Cultivating Success website. If you have any challenges with your sound or clarity, you can always type in the chat. Our program coordinator, Kate Wood, is standing by to help with any technical issues. It may help to close the other programs that are running on your computer. You can also always switch to the phone. And to do that, you would just go to the audio in your control bar, hit the up arrow, and follow the instructions for changing to phone audio. With that, I'm happy to welcome Samuel DeGray, who's going to give the presentation today, and he'll be able to introduce himself. If you have any questions, again, please post them in the chat. And while Samuel's getting his slides up and running, we are going to do a quick poll, and Kate is going to launch that. We would love to know how familiar you are with both cultural and physical pest control at the beginning of this webinar. So as you can see, there's 2 questions on the screen. Your answers will really help Samuel to better understand where you're coming into this presentation. So almost everyone has participated in the poll. We'll give it another second or 2. Okay, let's go ahead and change this. So as we see, most people are somewhat familiar with cultural pest controls, and there's more familiarity with physical pest control methods. So thank you so much. It's great to know where you're starting. Okay, we're going to go ahead and stop sharing those results and transfer over to you, Samuel. Again, thank you for being here.
Hey there, everybody. My name is Samuel DeGray. I am the brand new agricultural extension educator up here in Boundary County, Idaho, which is Idaho's northernmost county. So I was initially the one who was supposed to be giving this webinar. It was originally supposed to be given by Desiree Wickwar, my former coworker and friend of mine. She unfortunately had an accident and broke her ankle and is in surgery today. So I'm stepping in to give the presentation instead. But not that different from Desiree. I come from a background in integrated pest management research. I did a lot of work in fruit crops back in Wisconsin, and I was down in a research farm in southern Idaho working on sugar bee and potato IPM stuff. So a lot of the stuff I've done has been a little bit more on like the pesticide trial side, but we're definitely work with some of these cultural and physical controls, as has basically everybody who works with agriculture, whether they know it or not. So yeah, with that, let's get into the talk. Okay. All right, so just going through our schedule here, we're just going to get into a basic overview of what is cultural control and physical control, some different general tactics in each one of those 2 things, do some specific examples for different categories of pests, and then go through a couple of case studies that are drawn directly from Desiree's past research. So probably not what I would have chosen, but I've read some of her papers, so I'll talk about that too. So I think a lot of you have probably taken the webinar or 2 that were before this in the series, but just going over a little bit, a general overview of what integrated pest management is. So you can think of this as like a holistic, multifaceted, science-based approach to pest management. So the kind of bottom of the pyramid of this is knowing your pest and its life cycle. So the first step is always monitoring and identifying your pests. Knowing their life cycle, knowing when they emerge, when they are doing damage, that kind of stuff is kind of the key. I would also kind of throw in here more like environmental knowledge, like knowing your soil types, knowing your climate, all that kind of stuff is the first step to good integrated pest management. And then once again, I assume you guys probably already familiar with this, but action threshold, that's the point at which you're going to want to start managing so that you don't reach your economic injury threshold, which is the point where your pest is causing enough damage to significantly harm your crop. Um, so if you're at that point, which you're going to find out if you're at that point or not by monitoring, then you're going to start looking into what treatment tactic is best for your pest. And even though that's kind of how it is on this diagram, a lot of these cultural and physical control methods are probably best moved to even before monitoring because a lot of them are more preventative than proactive. Um, and so then once again, the whole cycle kind of loops back around to each other, monitoring, identifying pests. And, once again, a lot of these cultural and physical control methods are things that you'll probably be informed by your monitoring from last year and implement them, well in advance, even before the growing season starts. Um, so moving on, this is the kind of pyramid of IPM tactics and tools. So at the bottom, prevention, an ounce of prevention is the best cure, as I believe Mark Twain said that. Um, so think about cultural and physical and mechanical control. We'll get into the definition of those, but honestly, I feel like in practice, those terms are often used fairly interchangeably. And I often think of physical and mechanical control as being a kind of subcategory of cultural control. But yeah, you can definitely see cultural control as being kind of like the first step in IPM. And I assume that's why this was structured as the first type to talk about in this webinar. Kind of going up the pyramid all the way to, pesticides, which you could see as kind of a last result, last resort in like a well thought out IPM program. Um, and I almost would put biological control like kind of outside of the pyramid as a thing that you may or may not touch at all, but that's a discussion for Thursday. So moving on to the next one, just a little quiz, and please put your answers just in the chat here. So what is the purpose of APM, IPM? Like, what are you trying to achieve here? Are you trying to completely eliminate all pests of all different types, completely zero population from your field or ag system? Are you trying to B, keep pest populations below that economic or damage threshold? Or C, use your knowledge of pest biology and crop interaction to make informed management decisions? Or D, B and C only? So go ahead and throw your answers in the chat there, and we'll give you guys a couple minutes. And I can't actually see the chat, so actually I can. Never mind. Okay. It looks like you guys nailed it. Everyone in some form or another said the right answer, which is the purpose is both B and C. You're never going to completely eliminate all pests, right? That's just not possible. And sometimes you wouldn't even want it to be possible because sometimes a pest can also be beneficial in some situations. But anyway, we're trying to keep pest population below a point where they do damage, right? And once again, for C, that's just very simple. We're just trying to make science-based management decisions with knowledge of pest biology and crop in our environment ecosystem. So good job to all you guys there. It sounds like you guys have a pretty good knowledge of what IPM is. There's the answer for that. So once again, in today's webinar, we're just going to be focusing on the physical, mechanical, and cultural control. So what is cultural control? So irregardless of what this definition says, I would think of cultural control as like altering your environment to manage a pest. And there's all kinds of ways that you can do that. Um, Tillage is a classic one, turning over your soil or not turning over your soil. Great way to manage all kinds of pests. Sometimes that can be something where you're tilling to turn up insects and expose them to like pest insects, to expose them to the environmental conditions that will kill them, whether it's winter temperatures or, hotter summer temperatures, or you could be no tilling or reduced tilling to, maybe leave weed seeds on the surface and leave those exposed to the environment and kill them. Crop rotation, classic agricultural practice, one of the oldest and most effective forms of cultural control. So that's alternating between, let's say a grain and then a legume one year. And from a pest management side, that's making sure you're not planting the same type of crop and you're not building up your pest and disease populations from year to year. And of course, water and fertility management, making sure that your crops are irrigated enough and fertilized enough and are also not irrigated too much or fertilized too much because either one of the ends of that spectrum can cause problems with pests. Um, so the cool thing about cultural control with IPM is that a lot of these are going to have benefits to your crop outside of just pest management. A lot of them are core agricultural practices already that you can enhance to have a pest management effect on top of that. Um, so yeah, that's basically it for culture control. Moving on to physical and mechanical control. And once again, I kind of think of this as a subcategory of cultural control a lot of the time. So this is like directly physically either destroying the actual pest somehow or using some sort of like mechanical object to like exclude or restrict the entry of pests into your crop or ag system. Um, so some of the various methods include barriers. In this image here, you can see some row covers, traps, traps useful for a lot of vertebrates, even some insects, mechanical methods. So that's like, if you have a garden going out and literally squishing tomato hornworms, that's considered a type of mechanical control. Um, I would even maybe kind of like throw in something like a chicken tractor as kind of being somewhere in between mechanical and cultural control, whether your chickens are going through and eating various pests. Environmental modifications, once again, kind of overlaps with cultural control, and deterrence to colonization and location. Maybe an old timey example could be like a scarecrow or something like that. So pretty diverse. Anything that excludes, repels, or eliminates a pest physically, and that isn't like a chemical. So another fun little quiz here. Once again, these are some of the oldest classic methods of pest management that have existed since humanity and agriculture has basically. So going through these examples from ancient history, which knowing Desiree, it's not surprising that she chose this because she loves this kind of old timey stuff. But so ancient Greece, in 950 BC, using fire to drive locusts into the sea, draining marshes to combat malaria, and in ancient China, tining the planting of crop to avoid pest attacks. I want you to go through in chat and maybe just a list. Give me whether or not those are cultural and or physical controls for each one. So you're choosing between one of the two. So once again, cultural is going to be modifying your environment, and physical is going to be like directly affecting your pest. So give a few seconds for that. So there will be one or the other answer for each one of these categories. So yeah, this one looks like people are maybe a little bit more confused on the difference. So let's go ahead and give the answer. Some of you guys got it, but so that first one is going to be a physical control. And once again, it is, these are kind of fuzzy categories because you could kind of argue that fire is modifying your environment, sort of, but you're directly affecting the locus, and that's why you'd probably call this a physical control. And then, draining the marshes, that's a classic environmental modification to combat malaria and mosquitoes is what you're trying to get rid of directly there. Um, and then timing the planting of a crop to avoid pest attacks, classic cultural control, you know, lining up your environmental practices with when you plant your crops. So, and once again, distinction between these two things is fuzzy and probably not the biggest deal if you're, a little bit fuzzy on that one. So getting into the different tactics for implementing cultural and physical controls, the very first one is breaking the pest life cycle. So one of the, fundamental things is just going to be getting rid of a habitat where your pests can persist in your environment. And so this is, going to be one of those key things where that first step of IPM really comes in handy, monitoring and knowing your pest and knowing where your pest is in your habitat. Because, a lot of times as an extension educator, people kind of want to come in and be like, have a one size fit all answer for this kind of stuff. And you really just can't until you know what you're dealing with. So some examples of removing habitat could be mowing. If you have some kind of insect that thrives on like larger quantities of weeds around your field or something like that, maybe mowing down those weeds or some of those extra crops can help you manage that pest. Um, Plowing, you could put that in the category of tillage, which I kind of discussed earlier. Hoeing, once again, that could be a direct method for removing weeds. Pruning, for a lot of diseases, that's going to be a good way to get rid of some of the material that they like to infest. If your disease prefers to affect young leaves, or you even see the disease already on there, that's going to be a good way to get rid of um, that source in your environment. And then removing crop debris, once again, certain kinds of insect pests can overwinter in crop debris sometimes. Certain diseases, if you had disease in your field, could be persisting in there as inoculum. And so once again, a lot of these are not one size fit all things. Sometimes these things are methods that you want to implement carefully because you could also be eliminating like beneficial insects if you're getting rid of too much plant material around your field. So once again, it's really knowing your farm system and what pests and beneficials are in your area and choosing the best practice for it. So zeroing in on that kind of alternative host concept, weeds cannot just be harmful in terms of directly competing with your crop. They can also sometimes be reservoirs for both diseases and pest insects. So one example of this is some research that I did in southern Idaho with a disease called potato virus Y, which can be spread by any aphid coming and probing various weeds in the nightshade family off your field and moving into your field and carrying the disease from the weedy nightshades into your potato crop. So that's a disease that you actually can't spray for because the aphids aren't even like living on the crop. They're just kind of moving through from the weeds and spreading the disease from there. Um, so sometimes you're going to be able to actually like double dip with your pest management if you have a good understanding of your system um, by managing a weeds and potentially eliminating pest insects, disease reservoirs, and once again, Desiree has nematodes on here, another potential problem pest that could be coming in from other plants that are around your crop. Um, so crop rotation, that's just the basic concept of, if you are planting the same crop year after year, chances are you're going to be building up your pest and or disease population. And that's something that you really don't want. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the exact same crop either. Sometimes even just a similar type of crop, like a lot of different grains are very closely related. They're basically all cultivated grasses. So you don't want to go from, say planting rye to planting wheat, because a lot of the pests between those two crops are going to be shared between the two. You want to rotate from two different things that are drastically not related to each other, have different, maybe from a grain top to crop to like a tuber crop. So the different types of pests are even maybe affecting different parts of the plant. And no, what types of plant that you're planting so that you're not building up those pest populations. Going into a host plant resistance and tolerance, this is another classic form of cultural control. Um, so resistance is the host's ability to actually limit how well a pathogen or pest survives in that crop versus tolerance. A plant might be able to tolerate a large amount of pest or disease, but not suffer any ill effects from it. Um, and these are both really common tactics that a lot of people don't even realize. There's resistance to various things bred into a lot of our crops these days that are massively important that you don't even think about anymore. For instance, Hessian fly. Hessian fly was a massive problem in a lot of wheat varieties for a long time until they came out with resistant cultivars, and now it's not as much of a problem anymore. In the wild, not sometimes plants are actually able to tolerate a lot of damage from a pest or a pathogen and not actually result in any yield losses or really hurt their physiology at all. There's even weird things sometimes where pathogens and pests will actually stimulate more plant growth. Um, so once again, this is another, prevention is the best cure kind of tactic. And if you know what kind of pest you have in advance, which is not always easy, especially if you're a new farmer or something, then that can be really important for informing what kind of cultivars you plant. And sometimes resistant to one pest or environmental condition can actually confer resistance to other pests or environmental conditions. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in some of the case studies. All right, tactic two, avoiding pest presence during key periods. So planting and harvest time. So once again, or not really once again, this is kind of the first time mentioning it, but in this part of the world, we are a little bit limited on when we can plant by the timing of frosts and whatnot. But especially, maybe in a more mild climate, you do have more leeway on when you can plant. Um, that being said, if you know that there is a time when your pest is going to be having its largest population or be at its most detrimental, um, if there's some way that you can time your planting and harvest around that, that can be a really good method for avoiding that key period when your action threshold is going to be spiking. So if you're able to plant after your pest has peaked, I know the sugar beet root maggot in southern Idaho has a really early flight period, so that's possibly something that you could try to maybe plant after that to avoid that pest. Um, maybe harvest before the pest populations really ramp up. Once again, just because we have a shorter growing season, at least in Idaho, sometimes you're kind of limited on when you can implement these sorts of things. But if there is a pest and a crop that you have in mind that you do have some leeway with the timing, or maybe it's a pest that explodes really early or really late in its population, then this can be something to keep in mind. So what if you can't time your crop planting and harvesting to avoid the pest, and you can't modify your environment to get rid of the pest? What are some tactics that you can implement in that scenario? So there's some various ways that you can further modify your environment to make your field less appealing to a pest. Planting density is one of those things. This is, something that is really easy to implement, like on the home garden level. So if you're planting a ton of plants just like really close to each other, almost in the same way that planting the same crop year after year is going to ramp up your pest populations, planting a ton of the same thing really close to each other is also going to ramp up your pest populations because there's just going to be so much food for them and they're going to grow, you know, much larger in size and its size in terms of the population and reach that action threshold much earlier. Fertility, that's, once again, if you under fertilize, then your plants are going to be stressed out and more susceptible to pest damage. And sometimes even if you over fertilize, that can also create scenarios where your plants are more susceptible to damage by various pests. Um, Drainage, similar thing. You don't want it to be too moist, which can facilitate the outbreak of a lot of like fungal illnesses in the roots. You obviously don't want it to be too dry because that can stress plants out. Planting date, we kind of talked about that. If you have a pest that comes out a certain time of year and you have some leeway with when you plant, you can try to time it to avoid the peak outbreak of the pest. Sanitation, really important for a lot of, pathogens. You know, just in if you're thinking about like pruning your orchard or something like that, you always want to sanitize your pruners after each pruning session, especially if you're moving between orchards to prevent the spread of things like blight. And same thing with a lot of farm equipment if you're not thinking about that kind of thing already. And then storage temperatures, sometimes depending on how you store, you know, how you store products, you can eliminate or get rid of certain pests. I just had a spider beetle, which was brought into my office, which is a stored grain pest, and that's something that really favors humid climates. Certain stored pests prefer drier climates, so that's another thing where it's getting a feel for what is going to be the biggest threat in your area. Um, Another tactic is just having healthy, vigorous plants. If your plants are stressed out and aren't doing well, any sort of damage from a pest or even just the environment in general is going to have a compounding effect, right? Um, so proper irrigation, adequate, not excessive fertility, proper plant spacing and proper pruning. We've already kind of talked about all those things. For fertility, one specific example of that is nitrogen. Sometimes if you over apply nitrogen, that will cause too much vegetative growth in a plant, which can once again ramp those pest populations up to a point where they're going to reach that action threshold and start doing damage. So once again, it's just that kind of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure kind of concept. So highlights for some particular pest types. We're just going to go through some of the broad categories because you can use cultural mechanical controls for basically any type of pest. This is just an earwig, the fruiting body of a sclerotinia mold, and some deer. The slide is the only one that has some of my pictures on it, so that's always fun. Going back to the classic disease triangle, for a disease to thrive, you need three conditions, right? A susceptible host, a conducive environment, and a pathogen. So cultural control methods are going to be thinking about how you can interrupt one of those things. And that triangle, in this case, it's like a more of a Venn diagram. So that's going to be, once again, your irrigation and moisture management. Some pathogens prefer a really moist environment. Some will do better in a drier environment, or they'll be better, or they'll do more damage to like a drought stressed plant. Planting density, if you plant too dense together, and you can even think of density in like a time-based perspective with rotations. You basically don't want to have too much of the same thing for too long because that's going to build up your pathogens over time. Once again, sanitation, that's interrupting the pathogen part of the circle. Um, sanitize your equipment, whether it's pruners or your harvester, planter, every year if you can, even if you're not dealing with any diseases that you know of, because, it's not something that you can see coming out of in and out of your field like you can a vertebrate or even an insect pest, right? So ounce of prevention and worth a pound of cure. And know what are problems in your area and try to find what pests are a problem and diseases are a problem in your area and try to plant resistant cultivars if you can. And then once again, crop rotation. Same thing with not ramping up your pest populations year to year. So first example is, weeds, plant pests, you could call that. Um, if you're managing like turf, mowing is a great way to avoid seed production, especially if you have your taller weeds like this. I think that's an amaranth in this picture. So literally just cutting down the weeds before they get to a point where they're putting out seeds. That's I call that a physical control method. Mulching. So, you got your black weed tarps down, putting things down to prevent weeds from emerging or choking out the light. Reduced tillage, that can be a method. If you're not turning over your soil as much, certain weed seeds will be left, on the surface of the soil rather than being incorporated and germinating. Um, get plants grow large enough to shade out weeds. That's definitely an interesting idea. I've never heard of that particular thing being implemented, but perhaps, in the home gardenery, that could go back to just having healthy plants in general, and that will kind of have other benefits for preventing pests. Clean seed and manure, like know where you're sourcing your seed and your other amendments to your soil. I mean, that's a huge problem that a lot of people I know that talk about to me here in Boundary County with introducing tons of weed seeds inadvertently with their soil. Um, Clean equipment, make sure that you're not carrying weed seeds in with your, various farm equipment or even on your own clothes. If you go to a different state or country, be really wary of that and maybe look into what kind of weeds they're dealing with in that part of the world, because that's how new weeds and pests get introduced into new areas. And that kind of thing happens all the time. There's, you know, um, red water, water amaranth or water hemp or something like that is a new weed in southern Idaho that has a lot of herbicide resistance that's just popping up here. So these things are happening in real time. So it's good to think about that kind of thing. Even if you don't, if you're going on vacation, that might not be first in your mind. And once again, crop rotation also going to be beneficial for preventing weeds. Vertebrates. So this is like, deer, rodents, birds, all kinds of vertebrates can be pretty significant ag pests, including here in Idaho. So, barriers, that's going to be your best tactic against some of your larger vertebrates. Up here in Boundary County, this is a huge problem. We deal with a lot of like ungulates, like deer and elk and all that kind of stuff coming in and eating people's crops, both large scale farmers and home gardeners. Even like predators like grizzly bears, they'll come and eat, you know, they'll come and take the lids off of grain bins because they're so huge and strong. So, you know, fencing almost mandatory in some parts of the world for controlling vertebrates. Controlling weeds because they can be a food source for certain vertebrates. Um, Plant unpalatable varieties, especially if you're a home gardener, and especially if you're in a lot of parts of Idaho, it's almost necessary to plant deer-resistant varieties of shrubs. And a lot of times those are plants that have leatherier leaves or some sort of unpalatable chemicals in them. Um, Repellents, this can be all kinds of things like, you know, stuff that doesn't smell good or stuff that makes noises. If you want to go to really old-timey example, a scarecrow could be like a visual example, or even just, yelling at a bird is technically, I guess, to scare it off, a way of sort of a physical control, I guess. And then, harvesting, trapping, and hunting, especially in Idaho, realistically, is going to be a way to manage the populations of some of these vertebrates, especially here in Boundary County. Like turkeys are a huge problem, and that's really, almost all you can do about them a lot of the time. And then obviously trapping is going to be pretty important for a lot of your smaller rodents like voles and pocket gophers, which are, you know, can be a huge problem in some places. For insects, I kind of already mentioned this with excess nitrogen, but obviously you don't want too little nitrogen in your soil. So once again, knowing your soil, I think is kind of goes into that monitoring category of IPM. But if you over apply nitrogen, it can encourage too much vegetative growth, which can then ramp up the population of certain like leaf feeding herbivorous or phytophagous insects. Trap cropping. So that's planting something specifically for insects to attack that instead of your main crop. And that could be something that the insects prefer to eat over your crop. It could be something that's sort of neutral in how the insects prefer it, but they might be like cleaning off their mouth parts. That's something that people have tried for that potato virus Y thing I mentioned earlier, where aphids are picking up virus from weeds and then moving into the crops because they can just probe any plant and potentially lose the virus off their mouth parts. Crop rotation, once again, it pops up every single time here. There's a reason why it's one of the most widely practiced cultural control methods. Builds your soil. It helps for um, managing almost every type of pest. Maybe vertebrates are the only ones that it probably isn't going to affect much at all. But for insects, weeds, all those kind of things, diseases especially, it's almost necessary. And actually, if you're just a home gardener, because IPM is for the home gardener too, right? I think that is something that people don't think about as much, trying to rotate between your crops each year. That's still something that you should try to practice, I think. Don't just plant the same crop in the same spots every single year. Try to keep records of where you plant stuff if you're a home gardener and change it up. It doesn't even have to be you're planting different things. You could even just try to plant them in different parts of your garden. Row covers, just literally throwing some sort of fabric or mesh over your field. And mulches are kind of a subcategory for this, but a lot of people don't realize that mulches can be a strategy for managing insects. But basically, row covers are going to prevent herbivorous insects from coming in and eating your plants. I'm going to try this for our flea beetles here in Boundary County, which are a pretty big problem for a lot of gardens attacking things in the mustard family. Mulches can prevent certain soil dwelling insects from emerging out and then attacking your crops. And a mulch, a lot of people think of that as like plant material. But mulches can also include things like plastic tarps, um, even like reflective material, which can sometimes like heat up your plant and be less advantageous to certain insects. Um, but once again, these kind of methods really want to know what your problem pest is. Because if you don't have like a soil dwelling insect pest that isn't overwintering in your soil, then you really probably don't care about mulching for controlling that. All right, so this is going to be going through some specific case studies in cultural control, and this is going to pull from a lot of Desiree's research. So I'm probably not going to be able to speak on it in as much detail as she would have, but I went and reviewed some of that, so I'll do my best. So a bill bug is basically a type of weevil. If you see this grub over here, that's what a bill bug larva looks like. They're one of the most widespread and significant turf grass pests around the country. Um, I know that they are present here in Idaho for sure because I've seen them. Turf grass isn't really my world, so I can't really speak to how much people are dealing with them or how much they're spraying for them or using other control methods for them. Um, but there's kind of a relationship between drought stress and bill bug damage, where regardless of whether it's bill bugs feeding on turf grass and making them more susceptible to being stressed out by drought, or plants are getting drought stressed and then bill bugs are coming and finding them easier to attack and grow in. Either way, there's a correlation there where the more drought stress you have, you tend to see more bill bug damage too. And, with climate change and all that, and just all the mess with drought problems and water rights, which if you're in Idaho, especially southern Idaho, I know that you've thought about that before for sure. This is potentially a really big problem for turf grass, especially in our part of the world. So insects in general often outbreak under drought conditions. And oftentimes that's just because drought conditions are accompanied by higher temperatures. If you're in this seminar before, I believe growing degree days were discussed, but basically the more heat that you have, the more of those degree days and sunlight are going to accumulate, right? Because insect metabolism ramps up the more heat there is, basically, because they're, cold-blooded organisms, and that's how their whole life cycle is dependent on the temperature. There's also some other elements to this, like increased canopy temperatures, and once again, actually, you know, decreasing the defenses of the plant to some of these insects can actually also increase the chances of outbreak conditions too. And this, insect populations are often not that easy to predict, despite what I just said. And sometimes it's not as clear what causes them to outbreak, but certain types of pests, insect pests, are more likely to outbreak under drought conditions. And grasshoppers are a classic example of that, as well as bill bugs. Um, Also, if you think about like water evaporating out of things, a drought, like, you know, if you think about like water evaporating off a pond, that's going to leave behind a bunch of salts and stuff, right? And it's the same thing with a drought stressed plant. The less water it has in it, the more concentration of nutrients it's going to have in it too. So that's going to make your plant even more delicious looking and acting to an insect and favor their populations in that way as well. So this, I wouldn't worry too much about this graph. It's basically plotting BWC, which is a measurement of soil water content, more or less, against bill bug population. And the basic takeaway to get from it is that the less soil moisture you have, or yeah, soil moisture directly correlates with bill bug abundance. I believe it's less soil moisture, um, which would make sense for the whole drought thing. Maybe it's more, but yeah, this graph was a little confusing to me too. But once again, this isn't my research with Desiree. So if Desiree was here, I'm sure she'd have a perfect explanation for it. But the point is, for me, that soil moisture correlates with bill bug population. So this is getting into that cross resistance idea, which is really cool. And anytime that you can find something like this, it's amazing because it's like you're double dipping your pest management strategy. So when you think about like a drought resistant cultivar of grass, and in particular in this study that Desiree did, it was on Kentucky bluegrass, which is, as far as I know, one of, if not the most common turfgrass cultivars in our or species in our part of the world. So some of those drought resistant cultivars actually have tougher leaf tissue, thicker wax on leaves, and higher amounts of defense chemicals. Um, and so when you think about that, all of those things are also going to correlate with a harder time for a insect with chewing mouth parts to feed on the plant because they're going to have a harder time piercing leaf tissue. They're going to, have less of an advantageous metabolic condition because of the higher amount of defense chemicals. You're going to spend more energy breaking those down. Um, so in this case, one trait actually helps manage the pest better. And this is sometimes more common than you might think because oftentimes traits that will let you survive difficult environmental conditions will also let you survive difficult environmental conditions. Like a good example is like a conifer, right? Like conifers have really fibrous, tough leaves, aka needles, and a lot of times they're also not as palatable to things like deer, because they're so tough and filled with different chemicals, and those are the same things that allow them to survive in very harsh and dry climates. So we're seeing a similar effect on just a really small scale here with the turf grass. So in this data that was done in this study, um, so wilting resistance and dormancy resistance are just two measurements to see how drought resistant a cultivar is. And the more resistance to wilting and going into dormancy, and in this turf grass scenario, going into dormancy just means browning up, like when your lawn browns up in late summer, if you're not taking care of it, or if like a wild grass browns up, that's what dormancy talks about in this case. So both of those metrics correlated with a higher resistance to bill bugs as well. Um, so moving on to the second case study. So the main takeaway from this one was that a drought resistant cultivar of grass also ended up making them more resistant to bill bugs. Going into the second case study, um, kind of similar, once again, looking at drought resistance, but this time looking at the correlation between that in corn and in spider mite outbreaks. So this is just talking about the study. They looked at two different species of spider mites. One of them was this Banks grass mite, which to be honest, I've never even heard of before. Corn is basically a type of grass, if you didn't know that. So a lot of the same things that will attack grass can also feed on corn, which is something to keep in mind for that crop rotation idea, even in the home garden. And the other mite species they looked at was the two-spotted spider mite, which is a very common pest in ag. Um, so in a combination of increased drought tolerant kinds of corn plus optimal irrigation, that actually reduced the population of this Banks grass mite. And Desiree didn't put in her presentation here, but it actually ramped up the population of that two-spotted spider mite. So it depressed one pest population, but increased more. And that's just a great example of how these cultural control methods and control methods in general are almost never like a one size fits all scenario. Because sometimes when something controls one pest super well, it will actually favor the populations of another pest. So this just talks about the layout of her study a little bit. They compared different spray regimes, they compared different irrigation levels and different um, cultivars of corn with comparing the more drought tolerant kinds to the more susceptible kinds. And similar to the weevil, the billbug turfgrass study, once again, the more drought tolerant cultivars of corn ended up being um, under a drought scenario at least, and that's what the right hand side of both of these graphs is showing you, ended up being more resistant to the um, Banks grass spider mite, I believe it's called. Um, so that was, probably similar adaptions that help them resist bill bugs, as I suspect. Maybe they have thicker cuticle. But once again, even though it's not shown here, those conditions actually did favor, or at least did not significantly decrease the two-spotted spider mite. Um, so once again, not a one size fits all thing. Goes back to that whole IPM cycle. At the end of your treatment strategy, you're going to want to monitor and identify again. And that would be important in this case because you might see a bunch of mites running out thinking your strategy didn't work at all, but it actually might have worked for half of your mite population. So take home messages for this case study. The water stress drought tolerant hybrids had lower outbreaks of this bank bank spider mite. Um, Underneath a good irrigation regime, there actually wasn't a difference. So it was only under the drought condition when you saw, you know, a difference in control level. So it might have just been a matter of the corn being less stressed out in the drought tolerant cultivar in this scenario. And maybe even something to do with leaf temperature and the optimal irrigation. And two-spotted spider mite is known to favor kind of hotter, drier conditions. So maybe that's why they did better in the drought scenario as well. So just overall, these are very widely used. Once again, you're probably already using them in your garden or crop, whether you know it or not. Um, some of them, are these classic IPM tactics like crop rotation. Some of them are maybe something that are a little bit more novel that you haven't thought about as much, like using a mulch to control insects emerging out of the soil, or using cross resistance for something that is like resistant to drought and might actually be resistant to pests as well. And this is why it's great to collaborate with different people who know different things, because you might miss this secondary effect that a certain cultivar might have for affecting a pest in addition to resisting an environmental problem. Um, but yeah, so these are your kind of first steps in your treatment methods to hopefully, in an ideal world, maybe not even have to use biological or chemical control if you really have a dialed in physical or cultural control program. Although in practice, that's often not the case. All right. That's all I have for you guys today. I'll go ahead and take any questions if you got them, and thank you for listening.